My name, what little of it remains, is Kalen. Once I was a spire scout on Valkyrie III, a cog in the endless machine of the Astra Militarum. We were taught that duty was survival, that the Emperor's light demanded nothing less than obedience, that in our dying we would find purpose. And so I believed. I clung to it through the long nights, the endless rotations and the choking smog of the hive, the debts that chewed at my life faster than the LO sticks in my pocket. But none of that mattered the day the sky was torn open by shadows. It began with a sound that was not a sound, a vibration in the bones before it became a scream in the air. Engines, but not the plodding bulk of Imperial craft. These were sharp, cruel, designed not merely to fly, but to frighten. And then the wires fell, glittering threads finer than hair slicing through armor and flesh alike. We called them razor storms in training manuals, but words in ink do not capture the way a friend's head separates from his shoulders without even a cry, or the way whole squads collapse into heaps of rent meat before a bolt gun can even be raised. We fought, because that is all the Guard ever does. Last fire painted the air with red lines, but against their speed it was nothing. They were ghosts of metal and night, their armor black and fluted, their movements more dance than advance. And when they struck, it was never clean. A bolter round kills. A monofilament lash lingers. It tears, it drags, it makes music of pain. That was the first truth I learned about the Drukhari. They do not kill as an act of war. They kill as an act of art. I remember Sergeant Kellen, his Vox grill crackling with orders that no one could follow. He raised his chainsword and roared the Emperor's name, and for a heartbeat I believed he might cut one of them down. Then came the flicker, a Drukhari warrior materializing behind him, blade slipping under his ribs so cleanly the sergeant kept roaring for 3 more steps before he realized his lungs had been punctured. He fell without dignity, his body twitching like a broken puppet, and the Drukhari only tilted its head as though considering the worth of its brushstroke. When my turn came, it was not steel that ended me but silence. I had emptied my last pack, the barrel glowing faintly, and stood ankle-deep in blood. Then he was there. Vilkas, though I did not know his name then. His armor was black glass etched with twisting sigils. His helm was a mask that gave no face, only a reflection of my own terror staring back at me. He did not kill me. Instead, he leaned close as though listening to something in the air around me. I swear I felt him tasting my fear before he moved. The hook bit into my side, a shard of cold that pierced without mercy. It was not meant to wound fatally. It was meant to claim. My body convulsed and the world tore apart. The battlefield, the smoke, the screams, all of it was swallowed by a wrenching force that dragged me out of reality itself. I had no words for it then, only the sensation of being pulled through a wound in the universe. When I woke, there was no sky, no battlefield, no Valkyrie III, only the dark, not absence, but suffocation, a void that pressed against my chest until I thought I would forget the rhythm of breath. And then the light came. A sour, pale glow that revealed a city that should not exist, spires like knives, towers that bent against geometry itself, and streets filled with shadows that moved like predators. Kamara, though I did not know its name then. The Dark City, the end of all hope. That was the moment I ceased being a soldier of the Imperium. That was the moment I became prey. The first breath in Kamara burned. The air was thin and metallic, as though I were inhaling the shavings of a rusted blade. Every sound was sharp, every echo a distortion that made me doubt whether it came from outside or inside my skull. My body shuddered with the aftershock of that wrenching passage from real space, but there was no time to recover. I was dragged across a floor that was not stone but something far more alive. It pulsed faintly beneath my cheek, its surface slick with a residue that clung to the skin like oil. The Drukhari around me spoke in tones that were cruelly melodic, their words impossible to parse yet laced with laughter that needed no translation. They were not soldiers speaking of logistics or tactics. They were connoisseurs appraising a harvest. When I tried to rise, a boot pressed against the back of my neck and ground me down until the taste of the floor coated my tongue. My wrists were bound behind me, not by chains but by strands of energy that thrummed with cruel precision. Every twitch of muscle sent sparks of pain racing into my nerves, and when I gasped, I heard them laugh. The sound was low, refined like patrons at some opera house savoring the first notes of a symphony. We were herded into a chamber whose walls curved like the inside of a throat. Others lay there already. Men and women, some in guard fatigues, others in rags from a dozen unknown worlds. Their eyes were wide, their mouths trembling with the same question none of us dared to ask. Why were we still alive? Death had passed us by on the battlefield, but what stalked us here felt worse. That was when he appeared, the one who had captured me. Vilkas. Even among the Drukhari his presence commanded silence. His armor gleamed like obsidian glass, and from his back trailed a cloak that moved as though it were alive, whispering against the air. In his hand was an iron rod, its tip glowing a dull crimson. He looked at us not as beings but as a vintner might study grapes before the press. One by one we were brought forward. The iron touched flesh and screams filled the chamber. I saw a man I had marched beside fall to his knees, clutching his chest where the brand still hissed with smoke. His cry echoed until it broke into sobs, but Vilkas only turned away as though he had tested the tone of an instrument and found it acceptable. When my turn came, I bit down on the inside of my cheek until blood filled my mouth. The iron sank against my shoulder, and the pain was not pain as I had ever known it. It was not the sudden jolt of a las burn or the tearing agony of a blade. It was total. It consumed thought, memory, the very rhythm of breath. It was the Emperor's silence given form. My scream clawed its way out despite every oath I had ever made to endure. When it was done, I collapsed to the floor, trembling, the scent of my own scorched flesh rising like incense around me. And in that moment of brokenness I understood the truth. The pain was not punishment. It was not even cruelty for its own sake. It was a contract, a mark upon me that declared me owned. I was no longer Kalen the scout, no longer a man of the Imperium. I was thrall. Biomass. They left us there, writhing, the red glow of our new brands dimming slowly in the dark. Around me, men wept, women prayed, a few stared in mute shock. But even in their suffering I heard it, a susurrus, faint and low that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. Not words, but the collective hum of agony, echoing endlessly through the dark city. It pressed into my skull, into my soul, until I realized what it was. Kamara was alive, alive with misery. Every cry, every gasp, every moment of despair. It was woven into the air itself, saturating it thick as blood in the lungs. And we were the newest threads in that endless tapestry. That night, if time can be said to pass in such a place, I dreamt of Valkyrie III, of the smog, the drills, my wife's face in the lamplight. But when I awoke, it was not her name on my lips. It was the faint whisper of the Drukhari, drifting through the bars of our cell, savoring our fear like perfumers inhaling the rarest scent. And I knew then, we had not been captured for labor. We had been harvested. The first time they took us from the cells, I thought it was for execution. The guards moved with a precision that mocked the drill squares of the guard. Each step of their boots echoed like blades against stone, and the air crackled with the hum of their weapons. Some of the captives begged, some cursed, and a few simply walked with blank eyes, as though they had already surrendered whatever spark made them human. I stumbled with them, dragged along by the collar that cut into my neck. We were marched into a chamber so vast I could not see its ceiling. The walls rose like the ribs of some colossal beast, lined with balconies where Drukhari lounged in cruel elegance. Their armor glimmered like beetle shells under the strange sour light that poured from braziers burning with no fuel I recognized. And in the center of the hall was the pit. It was no more than a depression in the floor, its surface littered with rusted blades, blunted axes, and chains spattered with dried blood. The scent was unbearable, iron and rot, and something sweet beneath it, a note that made the stomach turn. One of the guards shoved me forward and I tumbled into the dirt, tasting the dust of countless others who had bled before me. Then I heard it. Laughter. It cascaded down from the balconies, light and silken, yet crueler than any scream. The Drukhari were amused already, and the games had not begun. A voice rang out. It was Vilkas. He stood above us, his masked face unreadable, his hands clasped as though this were a recital he had arranged for his guests. "Dance for us," he said, his words dripping through a translator that twisted them into Gothic. "Paint the air with your despair. Show us your hunger for life." Weapons were thrown into the pit. Not clean weapons, not the sharp steel of a soldier's blade, but scraps, toys of death. I picked up a shard of metal that might once have been a knife. The edge was jagged, the handle broken. Around me, the others armed themselves with whatever they could grasp. There were 6 of us. Only 3 would leave the pit alive. The first blow was struck by a man I half recognized, a trooper from another regiment. He swung wildly, his rusted axe crunching against the skull of a boy no older than 17. The crowd erupted in cheers. Blood sprayed, the boy fell, and his death was not his own. It was stolen from him, consumed by the laughter above. I fought because there was no choice. My shard of metal sank into a man's leg, and when he collapsed I turned away from his eyes. The instinct to survive burned even as shame tore at me. I had been trained to kill Xenos, heretics, traitors, not my own kind. But here there was no line, no enemy but the pit itself. Survival was the only prize, and even that was hollow. When the last body fell, gasping its last into the sand, the 3 of us left standing were dragged out. Our wounds were ignored, our breaths ragged, our eyes empty. Above, the Drukhari applauded as though they had witnessed a performance of high art. For them, it was not combat. It was theater. Our fear, our desperation, our betrayals, these were the brushstrokes on their canvas of torment. Back in the cells, silence weighed on us. No one dared speak. The boy's empty gaze still haunted me, and in the faces of the others I saw the same reflection. We had killed not to live, but to provide amusement. We were not men. We were instruments, each note of our suffering played for their sustenance. That night, as I pressed against the slick, pulsing wall of the cell, I understood something bitter. The Drukhari did not need us strong. They needed us afraid. They were shaping us, stripping us of dignity until all that remained was raw, unrefined agony. That was their harvest. That was their feast. And survival, if you could call it that, was just the bait on their hook. It was not long before they took me again, though time in the dark city cannot be measured in days or nights. There is no sun to mark its passing, no moon to trace the arc of hours, only the cycle of being dragged from the cell, broken in new ways and hurled back to rot. This time the guards wore different colors. Their armor gleamed with cruel ornamentation, and their movements were quicker, sharper, tinged with anticipation. They led us not to the pits of Vilkas's fortress, but through a maze of bridges that clung to the sides of spires. Below us stretched the abyss of Kamarar, a cavernous void lit by balefire, where towers hung inverted and shadows moved with unnatural purpose. The sight alone was a torment, for the city itself seemed to whisper, "There is no escape." Even the air conspires against you. We entered a new arena, though this was no crude pit. The space was crafted for performance, its walls glistening with dark lacquer, its floor polished as though it had been scrubbed with blood. The stands were filled not with Kabbalite warriors but with figures clad in flowing silks and serrated armor, their faces painted, their bodies lithe and sinuous. The witch cults. If the cabals fed on fear, the witches worshipped it. They were gladiators and torturers both, artisans of the body who sculpted agony into theater. I was forced into the center of the floor with 3 others. Around us the witches prowled, their movements a dance even before the performance began. They did not strike immediately. Instead, one approached me, a woman whose hair was woven into a crest that shimmered with razored wires. Her eyes were bright, her lips curled in a smile that was neither cruel nor kind but utterly indifferent. To her I was not a man. I was a material, no different than clay or pigment. She raised a blade so fine it was nearly invisible, catching only the faintest glint of the arena's false light. With a flick she touched it to my arm. I expected the searing cut of steel, the flash of pain. Instead it was delicate, almost tender, as though she were unwrapping me. Slowly, she drew the edge down the length of my arm, peeling back a ribbon of skin from shoulder to wrist. My scream tore free before I could contain it. The crowd erupted in applause. She held the strip aloft, letting it flutter like a streamer, and began to speak in her tongue. I did not understand the words, but I grasped the meaning. She was explaining me, my flesh, my muscle, the nerves twitching beneath the air. To her peers I was not suffering. I was a subject, an exhibit, a curiosity on display. They leaned forward eagerly, pointing, whispering, their eyes alight with fascination. The horror was not the pain. It was the realization that my body was no longer mine. Even my anguish was no longer mine. It was theirs. My shrieks were not expressions of agony, but notes in their performance, played with precision by a master musician. When she finished, she discarded the strip of skin like waste and bowed, her audience rising to cheer. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my arm, my breath ragged. Around me the other captives were used in similar displays. Joints dislocated, bones cracked, nerves teased until spasms racked their bodies. Each act was met with delight, each whimper a crescendo in a symphony of cruelty. When they finally released us, we were bleeding, broken, yet somehow still alive. We were dragged back to our pens, leaving trails of blood across the floor. The witches had no interest in killing us. Death was the final note of a song, and they preferred their symphonies unfinished. That night, lying against the weeping walls of the cell, I stared at the strip of exposed muscle on my arm, raw and throbbing. The pain was sharp, but worse was the emptiness it left inside me. It was no longer just the threat of death that haunted me. It was the theft of ownership over myself. In Kamarag, even your suffering is not yours to keep, and in the silence of the cell, I wondered what would be taken next. The next time they came for me, the air itself seemed heavier, laden with something older and fouler than the perfumed cruelty of the witches. The guards wore masks that hissed with rebreathers, and their weapons dripped with fluids that hissed when they struck the floor. Even the other slaves shrank from them. I felt it before I saw it. The sense that we were being carried somewhere far deeper away from the theaters and balconies, into the bowels of Kamara where light itself felt afraid to linger. The corridors narrowed, their walls slick with a sheen that seemed alive. I heard whispers not from mouths, but from the walls themselves. A sigh here, a faint moan there, as though the very architecture was stitched from those who had walked before me. By the time we entered the chamber, my breath was already shallow, my pulse quick with the certainty that this was no arena. This was something far worse. The chamber stretched wide, but it was no hall of honor. Hooks dangled from the ceiling like the teeth of some vast predator, each suspending a body in varying states of ruin. Some still lived, twitching faintly, their eyes rolling in sockets they no longer controlled. Others had been reshaped, arms bent into new positions, skin drawn taut into obscene patterns. organs exposed and displayed as though for study. The smell was indescribable, sweet and rotten, acrid and chemical, a feast of corruption that clung to the throat. And then he came. Ujarl. The homunculus moved with a grace that belied his withered frame. He was tall but hunched, his back adorned with a nest of additional limbs, some mechanical, some grown, all twitching with obscene purpose. His face was stretched and sagging, his lips drawn back in a perpetual smile that revealed teeth too long for his skull. He wore no helm. He had no need for one. His very presence was armor, for terror is a shield as strong as any plate. He approached me slowly, fingers like needles clicking together as though in anticipation. "Resilient," he whispered in a voice that seemed less spoken than breathed into the marrow. "Yes, you will serve well. Not as meat, not yet. As a map." They strapped me to a frame, metal bands biting into my wrists and ankles. A coldness seeped into my veins as fluids were injected, numbing some senses, heightening others. My vision swam, and I could feel every beat of my heart as though it were hammering against exposed nerves. My breath came ragged, shallow, each inhale a blade in the chest. Ujarl began his work with the precision of an artist. Thin hair like needles pierced my skin, sliding into the spaces between nerves. He traced them carefully, charting them as one might map a continent. Every insertion was a flare of agony so sharp it was almost holy. My body convulsed against the restraints, and he murmured softly as if cataloging a discovery. "Yes, this one sings in a lower key. Despair tempered with defiance. A vintage flavor." He dipped a long finger into the sweat that poured from my brow, brought it to his tongue, and smiled wider. Salted with fear. A delicate balance. I tried to scream, but the frame tightened around my chest, stealing breath, leaving only the sound of strangled gasps. My body was no longer mine. It was an experiment. Each nerve became a string to be plucked, each reaction a note in his private symphony. He was not breaking me. He was studying me, recording the subtleties of my torment as though he were a scholar and I his text. Time lost all meaning. Perhaps it was hours, perhaps days. When at last the needles were withdrawn, my body trembled uncontrollably. My skin traced with invisible lines of fire. Ujarl leaned close, his rancid breath filling my nostrils. "You are precious stock, not to be squandered. Not yet. The obsidian blade will feast on you for cycles to come." They unstrapped me and dropped me back into the pens, my body twitching, my mind fractured. Around me the others recoiled, not out of pity but fear, for to be chosen by a homunculus was to be marked. I was no longer just a thrall. I was a resource, a possession more valuable broken than whole. As I lay there staring into the pulsing dark of the cell, I realized the truth. In Camera you could not even pray for death. Death was not yours to claim. It belonged to them, and they would not grant it until every last drop of suffering had been drawn. And so I closed my eyes, and for the first time since capture, I did not dream of home. I dreamt of nothing, and in Camera nothing was a mercy. Camera is not a city. To call it that is to tame it, to reduce it into human terms. A city has districts, plazas, laws, the rhythm of trade and life. Comarug has none of these. It is not a place built by hands, but a wound in reality. A cancerous growth festering inside the webway. It stretches in all directions at once, its towers inverted, its spires folding upon themselves in geometries that mock reason. And through it all flows the sound, not of commerce or voices, but the low, ceaseless chorus of misery. I learned this slowly, through glimpses stolen on the marches between cell and pit. At first I thought I was hallucinating, a street that seemed to run sideways, balconies that bent into themselves until they devoured their own shadow, skies that were no skies at all, but vast canopies of void where lightning crawled silently, feeding on nothing. The air thrummed with whispers, too faint to follow, too sharp to ignore. The Drukhari walked through it all with effortless grace, as though they belonged to this fractured geometry. They dressed the streets with their cruelty. Slaves were dragged in chains, some broken beyond recognition, others driven forward like cattle. The cries that echoed from spire to spire were not an accident. They were sustenance, leaking into every corridor, every chamber, until even the air carried a metallic aftertaste of suffering. Our cell was nestled deep in the fortress of the Obsidian Blade, Vilkas's Cabal. From the outside it was a mountain of black crystal, its angles so sharp they seemed to cut the eye. Inside, the walls pulsed faintly, as though some parasitic life form ran through them. If you pressed your ear to the surface, you could hear it. A slow, wet thrum like blood being pumped through veins the size of towers. Whether it was alive or merely built to imitate life, I could not tell. In Kamarag, the distinction hardly mattered. We were divided into categories, though they never told us the words. You came to understand them by watching. The fodder slaves were the newest, still screaming, still clutching to hope. They were consumed quickly. Their pain burned hot and bright in public displays, and then they were gone. The maintenance thralls endured longer. They were used for labor, hauling, cleaning, repairing. Their agony a dull, constant flame rather than a roaring fire. They lived months, maybe years, their suffering harvested in steady, measured doses. And then there were the others. The ones like me. The precious stock. That was the phrase I heard once in passing, from a Drukhari overseer who walked by our pen with a sneer of satisfaction. Precious stock were rare and therefore dangerous. We were not permitted to die, nor to collapse into madness too quickly. Our pain was to be savored, stretched, drawn out until every fiber of existence was wrung dry. I realized with a hollow certainty that I had become valuable. Not strong, not brave, valuable. My endurance, my ability to cling to coherence despite the witch's stage and Ujarl's needles, had marked me as premium harvest. I was not to be discarded like the fodder, nor worked into dust like the thralls. I was to be maintained, kept, cultivated like a fine vintage in a noble cellar. At first the knowledge crushed me. It meant I would live longer than the others, live to endure more than I thought possible. But as the days blurred into one another, I came to see the trap in it. Precious stock did not mean safety. It meant I had been marked for exquisite ruin. My death, when it came, would not be mine. It would be theirs, crafted with precision, a final feast to be savored. The thought gnawed at me as I lay in the cell, listening to the endless chorus of Kamarag around me. The dark city was no mere backdrop. It was an engine, a forge where misery was currency and the scream was coin. Every wall, every spire, every shadow was complicit. To exist here was to be bled slowly, to become another note in the eternal symphony of agony. And I began to wonder, not for the first time, whether death had been kinder back on Valkyrie III. The days in Kamarad did not flow as they had in the Imperium. There was no sunrise, no chiming of bells, no vox alarms from a hablock calling the workers to the manufactorum. Time here was not marked by the turning of a world, but by the whim of the Drukhari. Their hours stretched and compressed according to their own rhythms, and we, their captives, were dragged along, helpless as dust in the wind. I do not know if days passed or weeks or years. I only know the cycles, the rituals. Our cell would be wrenched open with a shriek of twisted metal, and the lash would drive us forward into whatever chamber or pit the Cabal had prepared. Sometimes it was the arena, where the witches spun their dances of blood around us, turning our suffering into performance. Sometimes it was the laboratories of the homunculi, where pain was catalogued and dissected with the same precision a mechanicus adept might use to measure the alignment of gears. And sometimes it was worse than both, nothing. Days of being left in the pen with no food, no water, only the walls that pulsed with the faint heartbeat of the fortress. That silence was not mercy. It was its own form of torture. Starvation hollowed the body. Thirst cracked the tongue, but it was the absence of sensation that did the deepest harm. The human mind begins to devour itself when denied stimulus. I saw men claw their own flesh just to feel something real, something tangible. I heard one prisoner beg for the witches to return, weeping for the blade that had once peeled the skin from his arm. Better pain, he whispered, than this empty silence that gnawed the soul. The Drukhari knew this, of course. They orchestrated it. They did not simply thrive on pain. They conducted it like a symphony, crescendo in silence, screams in stillness. The torment was never random. It was measured, deliberate, as though every shudder, every whimper, was another note in their endless score. Bilkas himself would visit sometimes, gliding into the chamber with the effortless grace of a predator. His armor was always immaculate, black enamel etched with silver veins, his helm shaped into the visage of a serpent. He did not speak to us directly. He did not need to. A gesture, a tilt of his head, and the guards would act, dragging some unfortunate soul to a fate crafted for that day's appetite. Once he paused before me. His masked gaze lingered, and I felt it like a knife sliding under the ribs. Not a word was spoken, yet I knew. He had already written my end. I simply had not yet reached the right moment in his script. The others began to change under the strain. Some broke quickly, collapsing into gibbering shells of humanity. The Drukhari disposed of them swiftly, their usefulness expired. Others hardened, their eyes going flat and cold, speaking little, conserving what fragments of will remained. These survived longer, but their endurance was not rewarded. It was only harvested more deeply, their strength converted into a richer flavor of despair. I found myself caught between the two extremes. I could not fully collapse, though I longed for it, and I could not harden entirely without losing something of myself. So I endured in a limbo, aware enough to feel every incision, lucid enough to understand every layer of degradation. That, I believe, is why they marked me as precious. Pain without awareness is useless to them. Awareness without pain is empty. But the combination, the ability to suffer and still know you are suffering, that is the delicacy they crave. The routines became cages inside my mind. When I awoke in the cell, I already knew whether today would be blood or silence, needle or blade, humiliation or starvation. The very anticipation became part of the feast. My dread sustained them before they had even laid a hand upon me. And so even my thoughts were not mine. Even my fear was stolen, siphoned away to feed them. In those moments when the others slept fitfully or muttered prayers into the dark, I began to think of Kamara not as a city at all, but as a living organism. Each cabal a vein, each witch cult a muscle, each homunculus coven a gland-secreting horror. And we, the slaves, the stock, the chattel, we were its blood. Pumped, drained, circulated, the city did not merely hold us. It consumed us one heartbeat at a time. It was then that I began to understand. Survival was not the gift I once believed. It was the currency of this place. The longer you lived, the more you were spent. The first time Ujral chose me for his study, I thought it would be the end. I almost welcomed it. After so many cycles of degradation, the idea of a final breaking point seemed like release. But I was wrong. For Ujral, endings were wasteful. He was not an executioner. He was a craftsman. I was dragged into his chamber by two writhing attendants, creatures that might once have been human, or Eldar, or something else entirely, their bodies reworked into grotesque tools of servitude. The chamber reeked of alchemical fumes, a cloying blend of burning oils and metallic tang, and the walls glistened as though sweat itself oozed from them. Chains clinked faintly from the ceiling, and I saw that most of them were not empty. There were others, Shapes suspended in silence, their bodies pierced by hooks or fused into the walls themselves. Some still breathed in shallow, desperate gasps. Others twitched in half-conscious reflex, their nerves exposed like wires sparking in the dark. It was a gallery of unfinished projects, each body a testament to his hunger for refinement. Uzarl himself stood in the center, bent like a spider, his limbs elongated and jointed at unnatural angles. Needles sprouted from his fingertips. Tubes and vials were stitched into his flesh, pulsing with fluids that seemed to glow faintly in the sickly light. His face was not a face at all, but a pale mask stretched thin over a skull that shifted beneath, as though something inside him was still trying to claw free. He regarded me with the calm curiosity of a scholar, and when he spoke, his voice was wet and soft, like silk dragged through blood. Resilient, still lucid. You will do nicely. I was strapped into a frame that held me upright, my limbs spread wide. It was not designed for restraint alone. It was an instrument. The moment the clasps locked, currents of pain crawled through the frame into my nerves, teasing them awake, sharpening them until the air itself burned against my skin. Then the experiment began. Hurkle pricked me with one of his impossibly fine needles, sliding it beneath the skin of my arm until it kissed the nerve beneath. The pain was immediate but not overwhelming, not yet. He made a note on a slate of living parchment that writhed faintly as it recorded. Then he turned a dial on one of his vials, and the agony sharpened, magnified tenfold, until every pulse of my heartbeat exploded into a storm of fire across my chest. He did not flinch. He did not gloat. He observed. He spoke softly as he worked, his words falling like drops of acid. The human frame is crude but persistent. Its pain threshold is resilient in ways the Eldari are not. Your fear resonates at a higher frequency. Curious. Curious. He traced my nerves as though they were cartographic lines, mapping the landscape of my torment. Each adjustment to his apparatus sent me to the edge of madness, then drew me back, hovering at the brink without ever letting me fall. He would pause, dip a finger into the sweat that drenched my brow, taste it thoughtfully and murmur, "Ah, despair. Ripe, but not yet overripe." "A promising vintage," I screamed, though the sound barely registered to me anymore. It was not a cry for mercy. I had long since abandoned that hope. It was a reflex, an exhalation of raw energy that left me shuddering and weak. He nodded approvingly each time, as though cataloging the music of my agony along with the sensations. Hours, or perhaps only moments, passed this way. Time fractured under the scalpel. At last he withdrew his needles, adjusted a final vial, and leaned close enough that I felt the cold hiss of his breath. "You will last," he whispered. "You will give me much to study." And then I was unshackled, half carried back to the cell, my body trembling and my nerves screaming with phantom fire. I collapsed onto the floor among the others, shaking, unable to speak. They did not ask what had happened. They already knew. In the silence that followed, I realized something more terrible than the pain itself. Uzarl had not been testing my body. He had been testing my soul. He was measuring not just how much torment I could endure, but how far he could stretch the essence of me before it tore. And he had found what he sought. I was not broken, not yet. And that in Kamara was the worst fate of all. There comes a point when pain ceases to be an intruder. It becomes the rhythm of existence, a constant pulse woven into the marrow of your being. At first I had fought it. I had clung to the thought of Valkyrie III, to the scent of promethium drifting from the manufactorums, to the memory of my wife's face in the dim glow of a ration lamp. Those memories had been my shield, the last bastion against the darkness. But Kamarug knows how to unmake shields. They began to fade. Not all at once, but like parchment crumbling at the edges. Her face became less distinct, the curl of her smile blurring into a vague shape. My world became harder to recall. as though the city itself was feeding on it, gnawing away at the corners of my soul until only the present remained. I began to wonder if it was deliberate, if the Drukhari were drawing the strength of my memories out of me, siphoning them as carefully as Ujarl siphoned my despair. Hope became a weapon they turned against us. Those who whispered prayers to the God Emperor, those who dreamed of rescue, they were singled out. The witches loved to play with them most of all. One guardsman, a youth barely into his third decade, dared to shout "Forterra" as he was dragged into the pit. They did not kill him swiftly. They broke him across hours, stripping his defiance layer by layer until his voice was reduced to a hoarse whimper. His courage sustained them longer than his body ever could. By the time he was gone, I wished he had remained silent. I began to understand the cruelest truth of Kamara. It was not only the body they sought to master, but the narrative of the soul. To resist was to feed them. To despair was to feed them. To hope was to feed them. Every thought, every reflex, every flicker of emotion became their property, harvested and consumed. The only thing they could not use was emptiness. And so the human mind, desperate to survive, learns to hollow itself out. That is when I began to feel the surrender creeping in. It was not dramatic, not a breaking scream or a final collapse. It was quieter than that, more insidious. It was the moment I realized that I no longer prayed for escape. I no longer whispered my wife's name. I no longer tried to remember the sound of home. I let them fade, because the act of remembering had become another cruelty, another avenue for them to exploit. In that emptiness, I discovered something terrifying. They noticed. The Drukhari are predators not merely of flesh, but of attention. They sensed when despair deepened, when hope flared, when fear sharpened into panic. But when my mind drifted into blankness, into a flat acceptance of nothing, they drew back slightly, not in defeat but in suspicion. They knew such emptiness could not last. Sooner or later they would find a way to puncture it, to awaken some forgotten corner of my humanity. And when they did, the feast would be richer for its long starvation. That was when the arena began to haunt my dreams. Even when I did not dream, I felt its pull, the echo of cheering voices, the scent of blood sprayed across stone, the looming shadow of the grotesques, those impossible engines of flesh waiting. I knew that sooner or later my path would end there. Not in escape, not in rescue, but in spectacle. The city would take me into its heart, and I would bleed my last for the delight of thousands. Yet even this knowledge did not feel like despair. It was simply the next inevitability. The idea of fighting, of surviving, of enduring another cycle seemed more unbearable than the final end. If I could meet it without screaming, if I could rob them of that final note, perhaps it would mean something. Perhaps it would mean I had not been entirely devoured. Kamara had stripped me of everything else. Perhaps dignity was the only weapon left. Chapter 3. The Crucible of Agony. The first time I was taken into the arena, I thought I had died, not because of the pain, though that came soon enough, but because of the sheer scale of it. The chamber into which we were herded was not made for mortals. It was vast, a dome of obsidian glass and blood-slick stone, tier upon tier of balconies rising into shadow. Every seat was filled, every spire crowded with Drukhari. They stood in silence as we were dragged onto the floor, their eyes glittering in the half-light, their anticipation a pressure that seemed to crush the breath from my lungs. Then the silence broke, a single scream, high and triumphant, and the crowd answered with a roar that seemed to split the air itself. It was not the roar of joy, nor anger, nor anything human. It was hunger, pure and unfiltered, amplified by 1,000 cruel voices until it became a storm. I felt it in my bones, a vibration that rattled my teeth and left my stomach hollow. We were 5 that day. A mix of stock, myself, 2 guardsmen from different regiments, a feral from some backwater planet, and a slender figure whose pointed ears marked him as an Eldar outcast. He did not meet our eyes. He stared at the ground as though he already knew what was coming. The witches entered with theatrical grace. Their armor was sculpted to gleam in the sickly arena light, their blades so fine they seemed to drink shadow. They moved like dancers, their bodies flowing with unnatural poise, their steps precise and deliberate. To them this was not combat. It was theater, and we were their props the feral man tried to fight. He hurled himself at one of them, snarling like a beast. She sidestepped without effort, her blade flickering in an arc that opened his throat in a single motion. But she did not kill him, not yet. She held him as he staggered, blood pumping from the wound, and with her free hand she traced the edge of the cut, guiding the crimson flow in delicate patterns across his chest. The crowd shrieked its delight as he fell, choking on his own blood, a living canvas slowly being completed. The guardsmen lasted longer. They tried to fight together, clumsy in their desperation but still disciplined enough to keep formation. The witches toyed with them, circling, striking shallow cuts to weaken, to exhaust, to draw out the screams. One fell when his knee was severed with surgical precision. The other screamed his comrade's name until his lungs collapsed from punctures carefully placed between his ribs. The Eldar outcast did not resist at all. He simply stood trembling until one of the witches approached and caressed his cheek with her blade. She whispered something in their tongue, a word too soft for me to catch, and then she began to carve him, not to kill, not to maim, but to sculpt. His flesh was shaped into ribbons, peeled and twisted, his cries harmonizing with the gasps of the audience. By the time she was done, he was little more than a living sculpture trembling on broken legs, his agony arranged like a melody. And then they came for me. The crowd fell silent again as I was dragged to the center. I could feel their hunger pressing against me, a tide of anticipation that made my skin crawl. The witch who faced me was not beautiful, not in any human sense, but she moved with the inevitability of a blade sliding from its sheath. Her eyes never left mine as she circled, her knives glinting with every step. She wanted me to see it, to know it. When the first cut came, it was almost gentle, a line across my arm, shallow but precise. The pain was sharp but not overwhelming. Then another, parallel to the first. Then another. She was not striking. She was drawing. My flesh became her canvas, each line deliberate, each cut designed not to disable but to shape. I gasped not at the pain but at the sickening realization. She was not trying to kill me. She was trying to create something from me. The crowd roared approval as the blood ran in lines down my arm, as she lifted the ribbons of skin to display to them like a craftsman unveiling a sculpture. And I understood in that moment that in camera even your suffering was not yours. It belonged to them. Your body, your cries, your very identity were materials to be consumed, reshaped, and discarded when the artistry was done. I stood in the crucible of agony, and I knew I was no longer Kalen, no longer soldier, no longer husband. I was an instrument, and they were playing me. The arena became my new horizon. Days began and ended with its looming shadow, its cries echoing through my skull even when the cell around me was silent. I did not always fight there. Sometimes I was taken to watch, forced to witness as others bled their last, their agonies harvested while I knelt in chains, a reminder of what awaited me when it was my turn again. The witches never wasted potential. They savored it. Each appearance in the pit was different, and yet they all followed the same terrible rhythm. First, the silence. The crowd's anticipation pressed like a hand against my chest, suffocating in its intensity. Then the eruption, the shrieking tide of voices, hungry and desperate, eager for the first blood. The witches fed on that hunger as much as they fed on our screams. Every move was calculated to extend it, to sharpen it, to stoke the fire without letting it burn out too soon. I began to understand that it was not a battle at all. It was theater. Each strike another act, each scream another line in a script written long before we ever set foot in the sand. The witches were actors, the crowd their chorus, and we were nothing more than props, the necessary suffering that gave the performance weight. The pain itself became almost secondary. What broke me most was the way the crowd consumed it. I would hear their voices swell at the sound of a man's bone cracking, feel the entire dome tremble when a woman's final shriek stretched into silence. My torment was not mine alone. It was shared, amplified, magnified until thousands were drinking from it, their delight as palpable as the blood soaking the sand. Some slaves tried to resist the role. I saw one man charge at a witch with a shard of bone he had sharpened in his cell. He never reached her. She slipped past his strike with a dancer's grace, opening his back in a dozen cuts before the crowd even drew breath. His act of rebellion lasted only moments, and yet it fed them longer than hours of ordinary suffering. His defiance had been precious. His death had been devoured, I learned from that. I did not resist. Not openly. To resist was to give them a sharper taste, to make myself a more valuable vintage. Instead, I embraced the emptiness I had discovered in the cell. I let my mind drift as they carved me, let my body shake and bleed, but kept my spirit flat and dull. They did not cheer as loudly for me then, but they did not discard me either. I was precious stock after all. My endurance itself was part of the performance, and so I endured. Cut, burned, broken, stitched back together. Dragged to the cell to heal just enough for the next cycle. Hauled again into the pit to bleed for the crowd. I became a rhythm, a pendulum swinging between agony and silence. My life measured not in days or hours, but in screams and the echoes they left behind. It was not without consequence. I saw the others change, each in their own way. One guardsman became obsessed with counting, whispering numbers into the dark as though they anchored him to reality. Another prayed constantly, not to the Emperor but to death itself, begging for the void. The Eldar who had survived his first torment simply stopped speaking, his eyes fixed always on some distant horizon none of us could see. As for me, I became hollow, not broken, not defiant, not hopeful. Hollow. The witches noticed. Vilcast noticed. Even Uzarl noticed. They watched me closely, murmuring to one another as though calculating the value of a resource not yet spent. I was becoming something they craved, a vessel not yet empty, a cup they could keep filling and draining without fear of it shattering too soon. And so the arena swallowed me, again and again until I no longer thought of it as punishment. It was simply what I was for, a crucible of agony, reshaping me into something less than human. More than chattel, a resource carefully cultivated, waiting for the day they would finally decide to spend it all. They brought us into the pit in pairs the next time, not against the witches, not against the grotesque beasts stitched by the covens, but against each other. That was when I understood the genius of their cruelty. The crowd was quieter that day, not silent, not eager, curious. They knew something different was about to unfold. And as the gates slammed behind us, as the sand shifted under my bare feet, I saw him, another man from the cells, a figure I had slept beside in the dark, endured the silence with, shared the thin paste they called food. His name was Darren, a soldier like me, though from a world I had never heard of. His eyes met mine, and I saw the truth reflected there. Neither of us wanted this. Neither of us wanted to become the knife the other would fall upon, but the witches did not give us the luxury of choice. They threw weapons at our feet, crude rusted blades, their edges jagged with corrosion, and then the voice of Vilcast rolled across the arena, magnified and sharpened until it rattled the walls themselves. "Fight," he commanded. "Fight or both of you die." For a moment, neither of us moved. The crowd began to murmur, restless, hungry. I felt the weight of thousands of eyes pressing down, waiting for the first drop of blood. My hand hovered near the blade, but I did not reach for it. I could not. To raise it felt like betrayal, not of Darren alone, but of the last fragile thread of humanity that bound us. And then he moved. Slowly shaking, he picked up the weapon. Not to strike, at least not yet, but to show he had heard the order. His knuckles were white against the rusted grip. His lips trembled as though he were whispering prayers I could not hear. I bent down almost without thought and picked up mine. The crowd roared its approval at the sight of us armed, as though the simple act of lifting steel had already begun to feed them. We circled each other. Not like warriors, like men on the edge of a cliff, each step too close to the plunge. I saw tears track through the dirt on his face. I felt my own throat tighten, my chest aching with a dread worse than any blade. To die was one thing, to kill him was another. The witches began to close in, their whips cracking at our heels. "Strike!" one shrieked, her voice rising above the roar of the crowd. "Strike, or you will both be flayed alive before their eyes." She gestured to the audience, and they answered with a shriek of hunger that rattled my bones. Darren lunged first, not with skill, not with intent, but with the clumsy desperation of a man who has chosen the least terrible of two dooms. I parried without thinking, the clash of rusted steel sending a shock through my arms. The crowd howled in delight. They had what they wanted now. Blood was only moments away. We traded blows, each one heavier with despair. His cuts were wide, easy to dodge. Mine were shallow, pulling short at the last instant. We were both stalling, both hoping for some impossible reprieve. But there is no reprieve in Kamara. The witches saw our hesitation and they punished it. A whip cracked across Darren's back, leaving a line of seared flesh that made him scream. Another lashed across my chest, burning the breath from my lungs. Something broke in him then. He came at me with real force, his blade slashing toward my throat. I barely twisted aside, the edge grazing my skin. My own weapon struck out, reflexive, and cut deep into his shoulder. His blood sprayed across the sand and the crowd erupted into ecstasy. They did not care who won. They cared only that betrayal had finally bloomed between us. Raw and undeniable. We fought until neither of us could stand, until our blades slipped from trembling fingers and our bodies sagged under the weight of wounds. At last the witches intervened, dragging us apart, lifting our arms like victorious gladiators. The crowd roared its satisfaction, drinking deeply from the spectacle of two men who had been brothers in suffering, forced to become enemies in blood. As they dragged me back to the cells, I did not feel victory. I did not feel survival. I felt only the emptiness of what had been taken. Not my strength, not my flesh, but my bond to another soul, stripped bare in front of thousands, consumed by the city's hunger. Kamara did not only bleed you. It made you the knife that cut another, and that was the deepest cruelty of all. The next time I was dragged into the arena, I thought I had already tasted every cruelty they could inflict. I was wrong. What awaited me was not combat, not a battle against beasts or fellow slaves. It was theater. The witches had prepared a performance, and I was not its warrior, nor even its victim, but its instrument. The sand had been cleared. At the center stood a frame of blackened iron, twisted into a shape that reminded me of a saint's icon back on Valkyrie III, though this effigy bore no holiness. It was cruel geometry, designed to spread the limbs, arch the spine, and display every nerve to the crowd. Hooks glistened from its edges, dripping with fluids that hissed against the sand. I knew before they touched me that this was not simply to kill. It was to unmake. They bound me in silence. 4 witches working with an elegance that mocked the idea of mercy. Their fingers were precise, their motions rehearsed. To them I was not Kaelin, not thrall, not even prey. I was a prop. A canvas stretched taut before the brush of agony. The first cut was not deep. It was a thin line across my chest, traced by a blade so sharp I scarcely felt it until the warmth of blood trickled down. The crowd hushed. The witch who cut me paused, raised the blade to the light, and then licked it. She tilted her head as though tasting wine, savoring its notes. Murmurs of delight rolled through the stands. My suffering was not just fuel. It was art criticism. Then came the rhythm. They worked in concert, two witches circling, blades whispering across my skin in shallow symmetrical patterns. Each slice was deliberate, each pause measured to let the crowd drink in the detail. They were not killing me. They were composing me. My body was their stage, my pain the music. At first I tried to retreat inward, to find the numbness that had shielded me before, but this was different. They were not content with raw agony. They sought to mold my every reaction, coaxing screams, sobs, gasps like a conductor guiding a choir. A blade flicked across a tendon in my thigh and my leg convulsed. Another traced lines across my ribs, shallow but burning, until each breath became a song of broken glass. The worst was not the pain, but the crowd's response. Thousands of Drukhari leaned forward in eerie unison, their masks and pale faces glowing under the sickly light. Their psychic hunger palpable. I felt them feeding on each sound I made, each tremor of my body. The witches shaped me not for myself, not even for their own pleasure, but for that vast, devouring audience. My soul was stretched across the arena as surely as my body was stretched across the frame. They reached a crescendo. Hooks bit into my skin, pulling me into a cruel arch. A wish leapt, spinning midair with balletic grace, her blade flashing across my back in a single sweeping line. The pain was incandescent, a lightning storm beneath my flesh, but the crowd's roar drowned even that. It was not agony alone that sustained them. It was the beauty of agony performed. I realized then the true violation of the witches. It was not that they tortured. It was that they demanded complicity in the spectacle. My cries became their triumph, my broken body their applause. I was not simply destroyed. I was curated. When they finally released me, I was not thrown aside like refuse. No, they laid me down with ceremonial precision as though concluding an opera. The crowd erupted in applause, a cacophony of psychic hunger sated for now. My blood painted the sand in patterns I could not comprehend. But the witches knelt to examine them as artists admiring their own masterpiece. They dragged me back to the pens half dead, my vision blurred, my mind trembling at the memory of the crowd's ecstatic hunger. I knew then that the witches were not just gladiators or sadists. They were high priests of cruelty, officiating rituals where pain became liturgy and the soul itself was tithed to the endless hunger of Kamara. That night, as I lay trembling in the cell, I understood something I had not before. Death was not the worst fate here. The worst fate was to live on long enough to become a part of their theater, again and again until you forgot where your own suffering ended and their art began. Chapter 4. The internal surrender. At some point, the screams no longer startled me. The pain no longer had the same sharp edge. It was not that it dulled. It never dulled. But rather that it became constant, a background note that blended with the thrum of Kamara itself. The dark city was alive with agony, a symphony played on 10 million throats, and in time my voice was just another instrument in its endless chorus. The mind is not designed for infinite suffering. It creates compartments, sealed chambers where pain is stored, locked away behind walls of numbness. But those walls are thin. Sometimes they crack, and a memory bleeds through. And for a heartbeat you are yourself again. Kalen, husband, scout, debtor before the next lash, the next cut. The next invasive hand pulls you back into the pit. I began to notice things I had never seen before. Not the agony itself, but the structure of it. Kamara did not feed on chaos alone. It was ordered, cultivated, stratified like a hive world manufactorum. There were levels of pain, categories of torment, each one feeding the city in a different flavor. There were the fodder slaves, the newly taken, still wild-eyed, still clinging to hope. They screamed loudest, their terror pure, untempered by familiarity. Their lives were brief, burned up like dry tinder to stoke the fires of the city. I watched them vanish one by one, dragged from the pens with faces still wet with tears, and they never returned. The witches and their audiences gorged themselves on that raw, unprocessed agony. Then there were the maintenance thralls, those selected for endless toil in the manufactorums and shipyards. I glimpsed them sometimes through the gates, a gray tide of half-starved bodies carrying, lifting, bending under impossible burdens. Their pain was not sharp but constant, a low hum that filled the cracks between the greater spectacles. They lived longer than most, but their eyes were gone, their voices reduced to hollow murmurs. And then there was what I became. The precious stock. It took me too long to understand. At first I thought my survival was chance, some cruel lottery that kept me breathing while others were reduced to husks. But no, it was deliberate. I was chosen, cultivated, preserved not out of mercy, but because I endured. My pain had a resilience, a flavor that could be returned to, sampled again and again like a vintner cherishing a rare cask. My defiance, my stubborn grip on sanity was not a shield. It was bait, keeping me alive because they delighted in testing just how much they could take before the last of me was gone. Vilkas himself confirmed it. He visited once, not in the pit, not in the arena, but in the pens. He walked among us with the casual elegance of a man surveying his collection of exotic pets. His armor caught the light in black and crimson, every curve honed to perfection, every edge sharpened like a promise. He stopped before me, tilted his head, and his mask's expressionless visor seemed to drink me in. "You last?" he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to burrow directly into my skull. "When the others break, you linger. Do you know what that makes you, little thrall? It makes you exquisite." He leaned closer, so close I could smell the sharp tang of ozone and the faint sweetness of whatever oils clung to his armor. "Pray you never shatter completely. A broken soul feeds once, an enduring one feeds forever." From that moment I knew there was no escape. Not in death, not in resistance, not in prayer. My suffering was too valuable. The city had invested in me, and it would not let its investment waste away. The despair that settled over me then was heavier than chains. I stopped thinking of escape. I stopped praying for rescue. Even the thought of death became poisoned, for I knew they could see it, taste it, and they would only twist it into another torment. The only control I had left was in how I endured. How I withheld the satisfaction of collapse. I became an observer. Detached in fragments, I watched the cycles of cruelty unfold like a scholar studying some alien ecosystem. I saw how the witches tailored their performances, how the homunculi recorded the tremors of our nerves as if taking notes for some grand, infernal thesis. I saw how the Kabbalites fed on the spectacle with a hunger that was not pleasure, not joy, but necessity, as though without it, they would wither into dust. Perhaps they would. I did not know, and yet in the smallest corner of my mind a thought began to flicker. If my pain sustained them, then perhaps my silence, my numbness, my refusal to yield the flavor they sought could starve them, even if only for a heartbeat. It was a mad thought, a futile rebellion. But it was all I had, so I learned to swallow screams. I learned to mask despair beneath a blankness that was not acceptance but defiance in miniature. They took my blood, my flesh, my dignity, but I clung to one truth, that even if my body was theirs, my final surrender would not be, or so I told myself. For in the dark, when the walls wept their oily residue and the air thrummed with the psychic shriek of a million sufferings, I sometimes heard a voice soft and cruel, whispering not from without, but from within, "You are already theirs. Your resistance only sweetens the taste. Your endurance is not defiance. It is the feast itself." And I could not tell whether that voice was my own despair or the echo of Slanesh itself, lapping at the edges of my soul. time became a thing without edges. There were no sunrises in Camera, no bells tolling the hours, no shift change to mark one day from another. There was only the endless hum of the city, a pulse as steady and merciless as a beating heart. Days blurred into one another until even the word day felt foreign, a relic of a world with skies and clocks and meaning. I began to count pain instead of hours. 1 lashing, 2 feedings, 3 performances. Numbers lost their shape. I would wake unsure if what I remembered was yesterday or a dream seeded by the homunculized drugs. Memories of Valkyrie 3 flickered like old picked reels, jittering and fragmented. I could recall my wife's hair, dark and soft against my hand, but not her voice. I remembered the smell of promethium from the spire factories, but not the feel of its heat. Even my name became heavy, a sound I could barely lift when I tried to whisper it to myself in the dark. Kaelin. Kaelin. Was it still mine? Or was it just another thread they would pluck from me when the time came? This too, I realized, was part of the design. Camera did not only feast on fear and agony. It feasted on identity. Each fragment of self stripped away was another morsel for the city's endless hunger. The pens were full of husks, bodies that once bore names, faces, whole histories, now reduced to blank-eyed creatures who flinched at shadows but made no sound when the blades came. Their despair was no longer sharp enough to taste. They were spent casks drained dry. I dreaded becoming one of them, and yet part of me longed for it. There was a perverse envy in seeing those hollow shells shamble by. No hope, no fear, no thought left to weaponize. Perhaps that was the truest escape. Not death, but the death of the self. No flavor left for the Drukhari to drink. A bitter, useless husk cast aside. But I was not so lucky. My mind clung on, clawing at the edges of thought, refusing to let go. Even as my body sagged, even as my memories bled away, something inside refused to collapse. I began to watch the Drukhari themselves differently. When Vilkas walked among us, when the witches performed their ballets of blood, I saw not only predators but addicts. Their movements were too precise, their hunger too sharp. They were not simply cruel for pleasure's sake. They needed this. Without our pain, they withered. Without our fear, their spirits frayed under the gnawing of Slanesh. They were starving creatures building an empire out of a slaughterhouse, telling themselves it was art. This thought, fragile and poisonous, gave me a strange kind of strength. Not hope, I had none left, but clarity. If they needed me, then at least in some small way I was not entirely powerless. My pain sustained them. My despair was their air. If I could hide it, dull it, smother it in the numbness I had begun to master, then perhaps I could deny them a mouthful. It was a petty rebellion, a flicker of control in an ocean of helplessness, but it was mine. And yet each time I tried, they adapted. The witches would shift their techniques. The homunculi would inject new serums that burned through my veins like molten glass, stripping away my defenses, forcing my reactions back to the surface. They knew when my agony had gone stale. They refreshed it like vintners tending their vines, ensuring each harvest was as rich as the last. Some nights, lying in the cell with my back against the pulsing, oily wall, I would feel the city itself breathing around me. I would wonder if Camera was not merely a place but a living organism. The Drukhari, its parasites and caretakers both, and we, the slaves, the thralls, the precious stock, we were its blood. This was not survival anymore. This was cultivation, and I was a crop they refused to let die. There is a point in suffering where your own pain becomes a backdrop, and the world beyond the blade begins to bleed into focus. It was not mercy that allowed me to see Camera's deeper rhythms. It was endurance. The longer I lived, the more they used me. The more cycles I endured, the more fragments of the city seeped into my mind. I began to notice the colors of the Kabbalite armor, the subtle differences in their masks and insignias. The obsidian blade, Vilkas's cabal, favored dark fluted plates streaked with crimson veins, their splinter weapons etched with jagged runes. But other Cabalites came too. Their armor shimmered with hues like oil on water, their blades barbed in strange patterns. They would whisper to Vilkas's lieutenants, trade chits of information, and then vanish back into the labyrinth. Even in a city built on predation, there were politics, games of power being played across a web of alliances and betrayals, as delicate and cruel as a spider's silk. The witches were not a single cult either. I learned their names in fragments whispered by slaves, in the barked orders of their trainers. The cult of the red grief, the cult of the poisoned kiss, the cult of strife. Each had its own rituals, its own preferred agonies. One would slice with surgical precision, drawing blood like calligraphy. Another favored poisons that caused the flesh to blister in patterns before the blade came. They competed not just for skill, but for innovation. Suffering was a market here, and we were its currency. And deeper still, below the cabal and the cults, were the covens, the homunculi. Uzarl was only one of them, a shadow among shadows. I glimpsed him sometimes when they came to collect specimens from the pens. He would glide past, hunched and multi-limbed, his flesh stitched and restitched into some parody of grace. Behind him shuffled things that had once been people, now reconfigured into instruments, carriers, or silent bodyguards with masks grafted to their faces. The covens did not feed on pain directly, not like the witches or the Cabalites. They harvested it, refined it, distilled it into new shapes, potions, weapons, living abominations. They were the roots of the city, burrowing deep into the webway. I began to hear rumors, not spoken to me but overheard in the pens, passed from one slave to another like contraband. Stories of an Archon whose cabal had been wiped out overnight, not by rivals but by something moving in the webway tunnels. A predator that even the Drukhari feared. Stories of homunculi experimenting on captured demons, siphoning their essence into vials of shimmering light. Stories of a vast rift opening somewhere in the city, a tear in reality that howled like a billion voices before it was sealed. Most were lies, surely, lies and madness, the byproducts of too many cycles without sleep. Too much pain without end, but some felt different. Some had that ring of truth, or at least of fear. I began to collect them in my mind, the way I once collected data on patrols back on Valkyrie 3. Patterns emerged, faint but insistent. Even Kamara had fault lines. Even the Drukhari had enemies, hungers they could not control, forces they could not cage. It was a small comfort, a poisonous one. If they were vulnerable, it did not make me strong. If their city had cracks, it did not mean I could escape through them. But it planted something else in me. Not hope exactly, but a sense that there were larger tides at work. That perhaps beyond my own suffering there was a story playing out in Kamara, far older and more terrible than I could imagine. Sometimes, when I was dragged back from the arena half dead and dumped into the pens, I would lie with my back against the pulsing wall and stare into the oily darkness. I would imagine the entire city not as a fortress but as a wound in reality itself, festering, feeding, sealed off from the light of real space but never healed. And like any wound, I wondered, could it one day rot through, collapse, and take all of us with it? This thought, more than any dream of rescue, became my secret prayer. Not deliverance. Not revenge. Just collapse. A final ending to the cycle, a darkness deeper than even Kamara could sustain. But the city endured as it always did. And so did I. I no longer knew the boundaries of myself. When I closed my eyes, I was Kalen the Scout, crouched in the shadows of Valkyrie 3's spire habs, watching for signs of insurgents. When I opened them, I was Kalen the Thrall, my wrists raw from chains, my flesh marked by hooks and brands. And sometimes in the drifting haze between sleep and waking, I was neither. I was just a pulse of fear in the endless machinery of Kamara, a note of flavor in a feast without end. Names meant little now. I whispered mine sometimes, testing it on my tongue, but it felt hollow, like a relic of another man. Kalen. Did that name belong to the husband who once dreamed of paying off his debt? Did it belong to the soldier who crouched in ruined blocks with a laser gun pressed to his cheek? Or did it belong to the trembling thrall who flinched at the crack of a witch's whip? I could not tell any more. The name was a mask, one I wore even as the flesh beneath it was peeled away. This was the cruelest revelation of Kamara. That surrender was not a single act, not a moment of collapse. It was gradual. It was layered. Each scream, each flinch, each prayer unsaid was another piece chipped away, another brick pulled from the wall of the self. The Drukhari did not demand one grand defeat. They cultivated 1,000 little surrenders, until at last you could not remember which parts of you had been yielded willingly, and which had been taken. I wondered often about the hollow-eyed husks that shuffled through the pens. Were they surrendered, or were they liberated? To feel nothing, to offer no flavor, was that the final defeat, or was it freedom? I envied them, but I also feared becoming them. Better perhaps to feel the agony and know you were still alive, still yourself, than to vanish into silence. But that thought was a trap too. The Drukhari could taste it. They could smell the pride I tried to wrap around my suffering, and they sharpened their blades accordingly. There were times when I thought I saw myself reflected in them. In the witches, dancing across the arena with blades so precise they seemed to be painting the air. In the Kabbalites, their eyes hidden behind masks that concealed the hollow fear gnawing at their souls. In the homunculi, endlessly reshaping flesh as though trying to deny the inevitability of their own decay. They were predators, yes, but they were also prey, gnawed at by a hunger so vast it threatened to swallow them whole. Was I not the same? My endurance, my numbness, my refusal to break. Was it courage, or was it only another hunger, a refusal to be consumed even as I consumed myself? I began to imagine myself as two people. One was Kalen, the man who still remembered Valkyrie 3, who still whispered prayers to the Emperor, faint and trembling though they were. The other was Thrall, the precious stock, the body that endured, the soul that flavored the feasts of the Dark City. They coexisted uneasily. Kalen clung to memory, Thrall to survival. Kalen prayed for collapse, Thrall adapted to endure. I wondered which would win and whether it mattered. Perhaps the city had already decided. Perhaps Vilkas had chosen long ago which of me would last, and I was only enacting a script written in my own blood. Surrender, I realized, was not something they demanded from me. It was something they had written into the bones of Kamarag itself. The city was surrender made manifest. Surrender to hunger, surrender to cruelty, surrender to the endless erosion of the soul. And to live here even for a moment was to become part of that surrender, willingly or not. Still, a spark clung to me, though I hated it. I whispered it sometimes, not as prayer, but as curse. If the city endures on our pain, then let it choke on mine. Let it drink so deep it drowns. A foolish thought. A desperate one. But in the dark, when even my own name felt like a stranger's, it was the only weapon I still carried. Chapter 5. The Call to the Void. The arena was not a place of chance. It was a cathedral of cruelty, a temple to the hungers that drove the Dark City. The moment I was dragged into its depths, I knew this would be the end of me. Not because of the beasts that awaited, but because of the eyes above. Thousands of them, drinking in the fear, the despair, the anticipation of slaughter. The amphitheater itself seemed alive, its walls of carved obsidian and bone thrumming with psychic resonance, as though the city itself leaned closer to savor the feast. We were 4 chosen that day, plucked from the pens not because we were the strongest, nor the most defiant, but because our suffering had matured. We were the vintages Vilkas reserved for special occasions. Around me stood broken shells of men and women, trembling and whispering half-remembered prayers to gods who could not hear them here. I did not join them, not because I had abandoned faith, but because I feared the sound of my own voice. In Kamara, even a prayer was flavor, another spice for their endless hunger. The grotesques entered with a thunder of gates and chains, each one a testament to the obscene art of the homunculi. Their bodies were patchwork horrors, muscles stretched taut over ill-fitted bone, faces smoothed away into slabs of scar tissue, limbs ending in hooks and blades instead of fingers. They moved with the lurching weight of nightmares, yet with a predator's purpose, as though each step was designed to savor not just the kill, but the anticipation that preceded it. The crowd roared. It was not sound as mortals know it. It was a psychic wave crashing down upon us, filling every nerve with dread. They were not just watching. They were feeding, siphoning every flicker of terror, every drop of despair, letting it flow into their hollow souls like water into a cracked vessel. I felt it in my marrow, the certainty that my death was not my own. It belonged to them, an offering to sustain their eternal hunger. One by one, the others were thrown into the jaws of spectacle. A woman, once a guardsman sergeant by the faded Aquila tattoo on her arm, tried to charge with a rusted blade, screaming the Emperor's name. A grotesque swatted her aside, her body crumpling with a wet snap before the crowd erupted in delight. Another fell to his knees before the beast, begging for a quick end. The grotesque gave it to him, tearing him in half with a casual twist of its arms, and the crowd howled at the suddenness of it, the brevity of the feast. The third tried to run, darting along the blood-soaked sand, only to be pinned beneath a hook and dragged screaming into the shadows, his cries echoing long after his body was gone. Then it was me, alone on the sand, every eye fixed upon me, every hollow soul drinking in the moment of anticipation. The grotesque shambled forward, a mound of flesh and horror, its every breath a wheeze of grafted lungs. The crowd fell into a hush, not of silence, but of focus. Thousands waiting, thousands hungering, thousands demanding I provide the spark to ignite their feast. Above it all, the voice of Vilkas slithered from hidden vox grills, smooth and mocking, each word a knife across my spirit. Come, thrall, show us your spirit. Beg for your emperor, or perhaps beg for your pain to end. Whichever you choose, it will sustain us. The words sank into me like poison, not because they commanded me, but because they were true. Every choice I had left was theirs. Every sound I made, every prayer I uttered would be harvested, savored, devoured. I was no longer a man. I was a moment, a morsel, a final flare of agony to light their endless night. And yet, something stirred in me then, something jagged and bitter. A refusal not born of hope but of spite. If my death must be consumed, then let it taste of ash. Let it choke them. Let it deny them the feast they craved. I bent down, my eyes catching the glint of a broken shard of metal half buried in the sand, a remnant of some other thrall's futile struggle. I felt its jagged edge bite my palm as I closed my fingers around it. The grotesque loomed, the crowd leaned forward, and the dark city itself seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the shard trembling in my hand, slick with blood. My blood. Someone else's blood, it no longer mattered. All around me the arena throbbed like a wound. The obsidian walls caught the faint, sickly green of the soul lights above, their glow casting everything in a corpse's hue. The grotesque advanced, its every step a living drumbeat of meat and sinew, its stitched jaws hanging slack like a parody of hunger. The crowd was not simply watching. They were inside me, crawling under my skin. I could feel their anticipation like insects in my nerves. They wanted me to scream, to plead, to stretch my final moments into something exquisite and long. They wanted me to break and offer myself as a living chalice to their starvation. I remembered my wife's face then. Not the face she had when I left Valkyrie 3, but the way she looked in my dreams. Her eyes hollow, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. I remembered the smell of promethium in the spire habs, the taste of ration bars, the rhythm of my own heartbeat on a cold metal walkway. They were not memories anymore. They were ghosts drifting through me, each one a flicker of a man I no longer was. The grotesque lunged, a mountain of grafted rage, its claws sweeping toward me with the inevitability of an executioner's blade. But I did not step back. I did not raise the shard as a weapon. I raised it as a final act of defiance. Not to fight, not to win, but to deny them their flavor. I whispered, not loud enough for the vox grills, not loud enough for the crowd, but loud enough for me. Let the flames of the Imperium burn this place to ash. Let the entire webway collapse and consume us all. Then, as the beast's claw arced down, I turned the shard inward. The edge bit my own flesh. A flash of bright, clean pain so different from their cultivated tortures. This was mine. My blood surged warm over my fingers. For one impossible heartbeat, I felt free. Not of chains, not of agony, but of their hunger. I was feeding no one. I was nothing they could use, the grotesque struck. Its mass crashed into me with the force of a collapsing spire, tearing the air from my lungs, shattering bone. The crowd howled, not with triumph, but with something like confusion, a ripple of dissatisfaction. My scream never came. My prayer did not rise for them to taste. Only silence. Only a sudden, empty silence that belonged to me alone. I fell, not onto sand, but into a darkness deeper than Kamara's void, a darkness that did not thrum with hunger. In that last moment, as my vision narrowed to a pinprick of fading green light, I thought I felt the Emperor's gaze, not as salvation, not as mercy, but as witness. And then there was nothing. Kalen's story ended in silence, swallowed whole by the endless hunger of the Dark City. His name, his blood, his defiance, all of it was just another thread woven into the fabric of Kamara. But the city itself endured. It always endured. For every thrall who found a way to rob the Drukhari of their feast, 100 more were captured, branded, and broken to fill the void. The wheel turned ceaselessly, grinding lives into sustenance for those who could not survive without suffering. The arenas roared again the next night as they always did. Another spectacle, another harvest. The grotesques lumbered, the witches danced, the Kabbalites watched from their shadowed balconies. And in the pits below, fresh faces shivered in the dark, eyes wide, unaware that they had already been consumed the moment they arrived. Kamara did not just devour flesh. It devoured hope, memory, the very meaning of self. Rumors sometimes whisper their way into the Imperium, carried by broken survivors who stagger back from the webway, minds cracked, tongues trembling with half-formed recollections of black spires and endless screams. They speak of the Drukhari not as raiders but as harvesters, sustained only by agony, thriving only in the consumption of what makes mortals human. Some claim the Emperor himself feels their crimes across the Astronomicon, that each scream feeds not only their hollow souls but stirs something vast and wrathful on Terra. Others insist the Dark City is untouchable, hidden forever in the webway's folds, a wound in reality that no crusade could ever cleanse. But all who have glimpsed it agree on one thing. To be taken alive by the Drukhari is not merely to be enslaved. It is to become a resource, a living chalice to slake an eternal thirst. It is to lose even the sanctuary of death. For death itself is rationed, delayed, stretched into art. Kalen's final silence may have robbed them of a scream, but it did not rob them of sustenance. His despair, his long erosion, his every heartbeat of suffering had already been harvested, siphoned into the city's endless banquet. In the end, that is the greatest horror of Kamara, that even in defiance, even in death, you have still fed it. And as long as the dark city endures, as long as its spires rise jagged against the void, there will always be another raid, another thrall, another soul stripped bare to keep the Drukhari from collapsing into the abyss they birthed. Komarach is not just a place, it is a hunger without end, and once you have been taken within its walls, there is no escape. Not for your body, not for your soul, not even for your memory.